In our last video here for this science communication module, we're going to focus on how you can frame your communication strategy by focusing on solutions in particular. So we've talked about this a little bit when we said when you're using the heat trapping blanket or the rampant versus regular CO2 metaphors, you always want to end with solutions. So here we're going to give some more concrete examples of what possible solutions are and also why it's important to choose certain types of solutions to communicate and not others. So when we're talking about these solutions, what we mean are focusing on solutions that are beyond the problems, right? So one of the things we're trying to do is highlight what can be done to make things better. So this reminds me of the Beatles song, Hey Jude. Hopefully some of you are familiar with it. One of the famous lines of that song is to take a sad song and make it better. So again, here when we're talking about solutions to climate change, yes, there are problems, but there are solutions too. So let's focus on what can be done to fix this and make it better. And when we talk about what can be done, we're talking about several different things. So if there are approaches, or programs, or initiatives. So these are all actions that can be taken at usually a relatively large level. So this is outside of the individual, and we'll talk about individual versus collective in a little bit. But when we're talking about solutions, we're wanting to emphasize and highlight what can be done to make things better. Maybe you have Hey Jude stuck in your head now. I've had it stuck in my head all afternoon after making these slides. So another thing we want to focus on when we're talking about solutions is we want to redirect away from the thinking that these problems of climate change are too big or too scary or too depressing for anything to be done. I like to think of this as the Eeyore effect, where if you think about sad Eeyore who's just dejected and sad, we want to prevent that. So sorry Eeyore, but we don't want to go into your cloud of sadness. We want to redirect and focus on solutions instead. This is just a complete side note, but as I was looking for pictures of Eeyore, I found this entertaining picture of a pug wearing an Eeyore costume. It's almost Halloween, so I thought this was appropriate. And when we're talking about and focusing on solutions, one of the things that we're trying to do is activate this productive thinking that we can rise to challenges. This reminds me of the great poem by Maya Angelou, where in an excerpt of that poem she says, "But still, like air, I'll rise." So here we're focusing on this mentality of, hey, you know what? We got this. We can do this. We can do this together, and we can rise to the challenge, and we can be productive and figure out a way to fix this. And one of the reasons it's so important in your communications with people to focus on these solutions to climate change is that broad-scale solutions are very rare in the media. So here I'm showing a couple different headlines from various news outlets, so BBC, CNN, The Guardian, and if you look at these headlines, they're all very doom and gloomy. Eeyore would approve of these, but we should not. They all focus on how hellish hothouse conditions threatens the future of humanity. Global warming may become unstoppable even if we stick to the Paris target. So these are all very much focusing on the problem but not the solution. So that's why it's really important when you're talking about climate change to other people to focus on solutions, because many people aren't getting that exposure from their everyday life in the media, for instance. And so we'll walk through some checklists here. So when you're framing with solutions, some of the things you want to make sure that you're doing as you're going through this process with people. And one of the first things you want to do is you want to prime a civic mindset by talking about values. And so I'm showing two different values here that have been shown to be effective when you emphasize them when you're talking to people about climate change. The first one being this value of protection, and the second one being this value of responsible management. And so the reason why values are effective to appeal to when you are talking to people about climate change is it helps people see that they have a role in this. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to leave this to someone else, or someone else can figure it out. It's not up to me. I can't do anything. But if you appeal to these values that we have a responsibility to protect the environment, we have a responsibility to manage it wisely, that will help to set the stage for a more productive conversation. The second thing you want to make sure you're doing is that you're moving from values and explanation of, for instance, what the causes of climate change are. You want to get to your solutions as early as possible. So don't spend too much time dwelling on all of the problems for climate change. And this is, again, to help prevent that Eeyore scenario. The longer you focus on the problems, it's easier to lose people into thinking that there's nothing that can be done. And so try to shift to those solutions as early as possible in your conversation. Another thing to consider when you're framing with solutions is that the solutions you're talking about, you want to make sure they match the scope and the scale of the problem. So again, that problem that we're talking about are these rampant CO2 emissions. The only way to deal with that, to reduce these emissions, it's such a large issue that this really needs to be addressed at the systemic level. And so when we're talking about and framing solutions, we want to make sure that we're talking about solutions at broader scale, so outside of the individual. So solutions at the community scale, so this is the state capitol, if you haven't seen it before, here in Sacramento. We want to think about solutions at the state level and also the regional level. So here, this is our region. And we want to make sure we're talking about these solutions in a broad enough scale, so not the individual. We also want to make sure that we frame these solutions as a collective community endeavor that's relevant to the local region. And the reason for this is that we want to emphasize that solutions are ongoing. So this is a normal part of the process, and this isn't something that you need to start on your own necessarily, but they're already happening. And so one example of this, as I was doing some research, is that here on campus at Sac State, we actually have a low impact development project, which I had never heard of, but the goal of this project is to capture stormwater to help us get through drought conditions, for instance. And so when you're framing these solutions on the local level, you want to, again, use this inclusive language and talk about how we as Californians, or we as Sac State, are problem solvers, right? So this productive thinking that we can figure this out. Another important thing to think about when you're framing your solutions is to think about your tone. And the tone is very important when you're conveying ideas to people. So not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it. And it's important to maintain a reasonable explanatory tone. So we don't want to do any scolding like maybe your grandma has done for you. We want to stay away from that. And instead we want to use a more reasonable tone where we're teaching about these solutions, right? We're not necessarily trying to persuade someone or preach to them that this is the only way. What we're doing is educating them about the options, the solution options that are available to them. So here, this is an image, Jack Black from School of Rock. Again, I don't know if you understand this reference, but here, if you look on the board, what he has are these different types of rock. So hard rock, progressive rock, grunge, so these different types and these different bands. And so if you were to think about this in a framing context, you wouldn't want to be trying to persuade someone that grunge is obviously more important than progressive rock or heavy metal, but you would instead just be explaining that there are different types of rock and that there are different options if you're interested. Although I do have to say that, obviously, I just covered it up, but the offshoot there off of Nirvana, Foo Fighters, is definitely the best option. That's not even listed here. But that's a side note. And I've talked about this a little bit already. When you're framing climate solutions, you want to emphasize these collective solutions, so not individual solutions. And the reason for that is because at least here in America, we have this very, very strong model and idea of individualism. And once that idea is cued or activated, it really prevents this other type of thinking that's less frequently used but might be more productive. And so if we think about this image here on the right, if you think about these two different paths as being two different ideas, for instance, we as humans are going to be more inclined to follow this more familiar path, right? And so in this instance, that familiar path is this individual one. But when we're thinking about how we can solve issues like climate change, we really need to think of these collective solutions. And so we want to emphasize those collective solutions, which in this case are that kind of harder, more unfamiliar path. And so we want to activate and talk about those solutions to steer people in that direction and prevent them from going to their default, which are these familiar individual scenarios. So that's why it's important to think about collective solutions instead of individual ones. And then next we'll spend some time talking about how you would go about doing that. So in your conversations, if you're talking to other people about climate change, oftentimes you're probably going to get the question, okay, well, what can I do about it? And when you're responding to that in a framing context, talking about collective solutions, one thing you might respond with is, I think it's important for all of us to look for ways we can make a difference beyond our own households. So outside of this individual, my own residence, but outside of that, what solutions can we think about outside of that? This is an image of a totally staged conversation, by the way. If you Google lively conversation, this is what comes up. So when you're talking about these collective solutions, it's a good idea to give really concrete suggestions or examples. So some of the things you might say are, you can learn about the proposals in your community that are working towards sustainability and get involved in those. So one of the things you may or may not be familiar with is that in many parking garages in Sacramento now, there's electric vehicle parking where you can park your electric vehicle and charge it. So this is one example of a initiative or a proposal that's helping us move towards sustainability, so that might be a good thing to get involved in. Another example of a concrete suggestion is to keep an eye out for opportunities to make connections to the issue of energy use, so that the kind of productive conversation we're having here starts to happen more often and outside these confined spaces. So that might mean, for example, that you bring up energy efficiency as an important thing to consider when your office is figuring out, I don't know, what kind of printer to get or something like that. All of these electronics now, they have some versions that are more energy efficient than others. So that's something that you might want to consider and bring up in your workplace. And another concrete suggestion when you get the question, well, what can I do? How can I address climate change? Is you can think about the organizations that you're in, so your place of work, or if you have a place of worship, and think about how those groups that you're a part of can take action toward reducing our reliance on and our use of fossil fuels. So for me, my place of work is here at Sac State. If I think about some of the actions that Sac State has taken, as I was researching this, there's actually several sustainability initiatives here on campus, one of which you've probably heard of was that electric autonomous vehicle Ollie. And so we have those electric vehicles at Sac State, which are helping to push us towards sustainable transportation solutions. So I've given some examples of how you can frame solutions and what some good solutions are. What I am going to ask you to do next, we have posted on Canvas something called a solution story bank, which is some additional examples of climate change initiatives around the country. And what I want you to do in the homework assignment is to use those examples from across across the country as inspiration to then do some research and find your own local examples of climate change solutions. So we're going to be doing some things with this in class, so it's very important that you do this work ahead of time. So go ahead now, this is the conclusion of this video. Go back to Canvas and complete this homework assignment where you can do some research on your own to identify and educate yourself about some climate change solutions that are happening here in our Sacramento region.